So I've come across some really great videos on this app recently. This one here by Jenna Matari and another one by Rachel Stewart, the Walking Criminologist. And what they are doing is deconstructing the propaganda machine that the Western media is putting into full force regarding what's going on in the Middle East. And they're essentially arguing that because of TikTok and because of the ways in which we can access information now, these narratives are getting picked apart really quickly. But I just wanted to add some context to this because it goes back to a book which was written by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky called Manufacturing Consent back in the 80s. Let me explain. It's a really important book. You've probably already read it, but in it they talk about the fact that there are 5 filters of the mainstream media that manufacture the consent that we have as audiences. And the first is obviously media ownership. Now, back in the 80s, it was pretty bad, but now in the US, there are only 6 companies which own all of the media outlets that we see on the mainstream media. So the idea being that actually the ownership of the media that we see on a daily basis is controlled in the hands of very, very few people. The second filter that they use to manufacture consent is advertising, because news media is free to consume pretty much. I mean, it was back then, it kind of still is now, but it costs a lot to make. It costs a lot to make in terms of paying journalists and everything else. So there's a funding gap. And how do they plug that? Through advertising. But the issue is that they need to keep the advertisers hooked in. So they sell us as the product to the advertisers to make sure that we keep watching. So it's got nothing to do with selling us the media output. We are sold as an audience for the advertisers. Now, the third filter or mechanism of consent is the media elite or the sourcing of information. In the West, we have entire systems and institutions set up. So journalists, so they get trained in the right way, they have the right political ideologies perhaps, and they get put in a room and they get talked at by a press secretary from Number 10 or the White House or whoever's in power. And if you don't subscribe to that particular way of view, if you're not complicit in that entire system, then you don't even get let into the room. And so if you think differently, or if you haven't gone through the various checks in order to get into that room, then you won't get that information, which is why it gets led to this wonderful exchange between Noam Chomsky and Andrew Marr, which he says exactly that. Well, have a look.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that
you're
journalists
self-censoring? I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Which leads on to the fourth filter, FLAK, F-L-A-K, which is if you are brave enough to put out a counter-narrative to the main message that is being put out by these big institutions, you get pushed to the margins, you get attacked, they try and undermine you, they try and find out dirt on you, and your institution or your individual persona is attacked and tried to be undermined and discredited. And the fifth and final filter is the common enemy. Now, back in the 80s, that was the communists, right? So there's a lot of anti-communist rhetoric in the mainstream media. But you go into the 90s and the 2000s, it becomes terrorists, and now it's immigrants. But there is always an other, a bad, evil group of people who are trying to come over here and destroy our Western way of life. So they get targeted as, the bad people which we need to attack. And that book is 40 years old, so it's become kind of common knowledge within a lot of the counter-narratives. And that's a real problem for the Western democracies who are using the media machine to try and get us to consent, because we can see through it. It's so obvious when you think about it. And the apps that we have, TikTok and other social media sites, and the independent journalists who have created their own networks and independent platforms with good quality, rigorous, sourced information, which is counter to the kinds of narratives and essentially lies that we're seeing. That's why these 5 pillars, these that buttress the manufactured consent, come crumbling down, which is what these kinds of videos are doing. So I applaud Rachel, I applaud Jenin for doing what they are doing. We need to keep going and push through these things and knock down these 5 pillars, because ultimately those are the only things which prop up the media machine. And if we can knock them down, that is why it is failing, because we can see right through it.